Hello, everyone. How are you doing today? I'm doing well. I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. The sun is down. It is still cold outside, but it's very sunny these days. I had a lovely afternoon, and now it is evening time, 7 p.m. here on the East Coast. Because it's late, I'm not drinking any unnamed diet beverage. I am, however, drinking orange juice with ice. That's what I'll be gulping throughout the live. This evening, we've got plenty to talk about. It's a lovely evening. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that I'm here. I'm glad that everyone is here. And we're going to jump right into things. We're going to jump right into things, folks. We have plenty to talk about. Plenty to talk about. I know a lot of you are here. We'll do that roll call that we always do. We'll be sure to do that. But before we get to that, and of course, remember to hit like, remember to hit subscribe. It's some weird stuff going on with not everyone getting notifications, so make sure you hit that bell so you get the notifications. But folks, let's jump right into it. The number one story that is on everyone's mind today that you cannot escape, no matter what channel you are watching, no matter what newspaper you are reading, no matter where you are on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google, you name it. You cannot escape coronavirus. Coronavirus. Everyone's talking about coronavirus. And folks, I know there's a lot going on about coronavirus. And I am not going to get too specific. I know there's a lot of things people want to say. People want to talk about the Chinese government and their response and how U.S. media isn't treating them fairly. People want to talk about Trump and his response, and is he not taking this seriously? Is he giving himself too much credit? People want to talk about the impact on the stock market. People want to talk about South Korea and what's going on there. People want to talk about all kinds of angles on this. Is this media whipping up hysteria? What's going on here? Folks, I want to take an opportunity to point out something that no one else seems to be saying. No one else seems to be saying. No matter where you are in terms of coronavirus, the people that are panicking, the people that are saying don't panic, nobody seems to be saying what I'm saying. Now, forgive me. I'm sure that you all will find somebody somewhere who's made this point. And I hope you can, because it seems like the most obvious point that can be made in the face of the coronavirus situation. The most obvious point, but I don't hear anyone making it. I've been thinking this the whole time, but I haven't heard anyone making this point. So I am going to go ahead and make this point, and I really hope that somebody else has made this point, because it seems so obvious. Folks, if you read any right-wing media in the United States for the past decade, half decade, 2 decades, I don't know how far going back, they have this lovely talking point that they love to raise. Quote, healthcare is not a right. Right? And they say this. And like, I remember that the Ayn Rand, the Ayn Rand Society or the Ayn Rand Institute was having a whole seminars around the theme, healthcare is not a right. I debated a libertarian a couple weeks back or a week ago, and they all said healthcare is not a right. And that this is like one of the central views of the libertarian, conservative, free market crowd. They really strongly believe that healthcare is not a right, that it is just, you are not, and they love, it's like a philosophical conversation that they love to have. They say, well, look, when you get healthcare, that is an imposition on someone else, right? You have negative liberty, right? You have the right to freely say whatever you want. You have the right to practice whatever religion you want, but you do not have the right to impose on others. By giving you healthcare as a right, you are imposing on someone else, right? You're imposing on that doctor. You're imposing on society to pay for it. Therefore, healthcare is not a right. This is, I mean, you've heard it, right? I mean, if you listen to PragerU, you listen to anything, Libertarian, Cato Institute, they pound this home like it is a central plank in their beliefs. Healthcare is not a right. Your health is your business. It is not my job to keep you from getting sick. It is not my job to give you health care when you are sick. You're on your own, folks. If you have a health problem, that's between you and the doctor. It's not my problem. It's on you, and society cannot be obligated to help you, right? That healthcare is an individual issue, right? And that you as an individual are responsible for your health. And the doctor, it's up to you to persuade that doctor and persuade that insurance company, and you are on your own with healthcare because that's the natural law and that's the way things have to be, and that's John Locke and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and individual rights and the non-aggression principle and blah 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 blah. Blah, 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 freedom, liberty, blah, 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 constitution, blah, 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 communism, blah, 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 Nazis, death camps, blah, 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 healthcare is not a right. We've all heard this. I mean, we've heard this ad nauseum, right? Healthcare, they say, is an individual question. Folks, the coronavirus. Healthcare is very clearly not an individual question. Look at this. This is an issue that we are having to tackle not as individuals, not as neighborhoods, not even as countries. This is something that the entire global community has to deal with as a group. There is no way that the situation surrounding the coronavirus can be dealt with on an individual level. This is a society-wide problem. It's a planet-wide problem. There is no way that you can address an issue like coronavirus with this belief that healthcare is an individual issue. Right? According to these libertarians, our response to coronavirus ought to be, well, that's between you and your doctor. Good luck with it. But nobody is stupid enough to say that. Right? No one's sitting there going, well, these people that got coronavirus, that's not my problem. Why? Because they walk around. You might get infected. Your neighbor might get infected. We as a society, as a city, as a country, as a global community, have to deal with this health issue, because when it gets down to it, healthcare is an issue that affects everyone. Healthcare is an issue that affects everyone. If people are walking around diseased, that's bad for everyone else. If you're in a society where people don't have proper medical care, even if you yourself can afford that proper medical care, you are affected negatively by it. The reality is, issues like healthcare cannot be viewed as individual issues. Healthcare, in fact, can be declared to be a right. It can be declared to be a right? When you have health problems, it becomes society's problem. And you can't get around this, right? According to the libertarians, according to the libertarian free market, Cato Institute, Ayn Rand school of thought, this coronavirus should be, we should just be saying, hey, well, that's between you and your doctor. It's between people with coronavirus and their doctor, right? We shouldn't be having travel warnings. We shouldn't be distributing masks. We shouldn't be doing everything we can to get ready for it, right? It's just healthcare is an individual question, isn't it? It's just between you and your doctor, and then the state should not impose, the government, blah, blah. It's malarkey. The coronavirus is the strongest argument I've ever seen that the government has an obligation to protect the health of the public. And if the government were to get up now and announce that healthcare is not a right and that coronavirus, well, it's your problem, you're on your own, that's between you and your doctor, the government's best, the government's least. If the government were to get up and do that, there would be riots in the streets. There would be a revolt. There would be an upsurge. There would be chaos. People would rise up. People expect the government and society at large to handle the coronavirus. People expect the government to step in and ensure public health. Right? It's that simple, folks, right? If the government does not provide clean drinking water, you are probably going to at some point drink water that's contaminated. You might say, well, I would, the private market, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but if there's a bunch of people with contaminated water around you, even if you can afford clean healthcare, you're going to have to deal with the fact that you live in a society in which people all around you are drinking contaminated water. If you, for example, are in a society where all kinds of people are dying of preventable diseases, and you yourself have the money to deal with it, you're still having to suffer from the reality of living in a society where there's all kinds of people walking around with all kinds of diseases that are preventable, right? There's a reason that we mandate vaccinations. Like, there's a reason that we have public health codes. Why? Because healthcare is a collective issue. And on that basis, it can be declared a right. Human beings are collective creatures. We always have been collective creatures. If you go back to hunter-gatherer civilizations, we were tribal, right? You go back to the ancient empires, the pyramids that were built, the Colosseum in Rome, all of that was human beings working together, right? That human beings work in groups. They are not individuals. And this non-aggression principle that no one should ever impose on anybody else, this idea that everyone's on their own and the government should just step out and the market always creates the best solution. This is malarkey. It's malarkey. It's a fantasy, and more than a fantasy, it's a LARP. It's a live action role play. When I debated that top libertarian, now by the way, that guy I debated, I don't know if folks saw it, Modern Day Debates, I debated a libertarian. He was the executive director of the Libertarian Party, and he really did believe that the ideal society was the Old West of the cowboy days. Now, what's interesting is that the understanding of the Old West is fiction. It was created by Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill. It was propaganda made to sell tickets and fill auditoriums, and the myth of the West, up into the Western cowboy movies and all that, it's a complete mythology. But, you ask him what the ideal society is, he believes that what he sees in cowboy movies, right, what he sees in old 1950s Westerns, he believes that is reality. And libertarianism is a lot like that. Another big libertarian, you talk about the sci-fi writer Robert Heinlein. Books like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, right? This is where libertarians are at. They're playing sci-fi, fantasy, pretend. They're playing Wild West, and it's a fantasy. And it's largely I hate to say this, right? People are going to get all fired up, but it's largely a white male fantasy, right? It is this settler frontier fantasy of white male all on his own, everyone leaving him alone, and it's kind of sad. And it ignores the reality that we as a human species are collective. We work together. We have always worked in groups, and that healthcare is something that affects all of society, right? If, as a society, people don't have the healthcare they need, it affects all of society. The coronavirus is a great example of that. We want the government to step in and deal with a public health issue. Public health is a society-wide issue. I'm sorry, I'm probably beating a dead horse here, and I apologize for that. But I just felt like it needed to be said, because I get very, very tired of this notion that healthcare people shouldn't be entitled to healthcare. I do believe that people are entitled to healthcare. I believe it. I absolutely believe that. You can put me on record as believing that every person, no matter how awful they are, no matter what, every person, as a result of being alive, should be able to see a doctor when they're sick. I think that. I believe that. And if that makes me the equivalent of Adolf Hitler, according to Ben Shapiro and according to PragerU and according to all these people, why, there you go, right? This is the level of discourse. On the American right, if you believe that every human being is entitled to be able to see a doctor when they're sick, if you believe that on the American right, they equate you with Hitler, right? They equate you with totalitarianism. They equate you with all kinds of awful things. Unbelievable. That's the level of discourse in the United States. And coronavirus blows this to bits. Absolutely blows this to bits. Folks, how are you doing today? How are you doing this evening? Glad you're with us. Let's do that roll call thing where you tell me your name and location, and I call you out as I see you. And don't forget that I love super chats, and if you super chat me, send me a super chat. I will talk about whatever it is you want me to talk about. So, names and locations. Hey, Caleb, what are your thoughts on Titoism and its history? Super chat from George Hess. You got it. Titoism. Ryan Overstreet, Broadway. Caleb, North Alabama. Hello from Cleveland. James in Portland. I blocked Stefan on Twitter. Scholarly Wissent from Alabama. Dallas, Texas. Ezra from Dallas. Marissa Noto in Buffalo, New York. Huey Long in Ohio State University. Long Island, Stanley Stan Lin. Jack Dundee in the UK. Box Spite from the Philippines. Christopher Semchek in Cleveland. Glad to be here from Georgia, says Jack Rabbit. Chessa, Alabama. Dan Uko from New Jersey. Trevor from Ireland. JT24 from Mississippi. Anthony Penza from Cleveland. Ramiro from East LA. Longtime friend of the show. Matt Williams from Sacramento. Good numbers, says Sammy. Heidi Edelweiss in Edinburgh, Scotland. Currently in Vietnam, says Eastern Socialism. Hey, everyone from Houston. St. Louis, Missouri, says Inundation. Portugal. Savannah, Georgia. Salut, Caleb, says Shaden. Acom from Winters. North Carolina, says Mark Shear. Pennsylvania, says William DeMarco. Comsomol, France. Tommy Farras in San Diego. Hello from Norway, says the Arctic Angel. Mark Shear from North Carolina. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now in Kansas City, says Old Gringo. Leipzig, Germany, says Atatis. Atlanta. Austin, Texas, says George Kraft. Syracuse, New York. Shaniqua from Buffalo, New York. Hi from Mexico. Casey and Matt from Brisbane, Australia. What time is it over there? It's Ollie from Toronto. Iron Candy from Berlin. Hi from Wisconsin, says Tina loves cats. What a crowd. All over the world, all different parts of the United States, all different parts of the Western world, Ireland, Germany, Toronto, Wisconsin. Whoa, what a night it is. What a night it is. Hola. Well, thank you, Old Gringo, and hola to you. Folks, howdy from Minnesota, says the Trash Pope. Ahawa from Racine, Wisconsin. It's currently 11:17 a.m. in Victoria, Australia, says David Fox. Talk about Saeed's Orientalism, says Sami Jabber, and I will talk about Saeed's Orientalism. Absolutely. Edward Said. All right. Oh boy. My attraction for you is bigger than electrons and protons. Well, there you go. Right? Skylar tuning in from Utah, says Clarence Darrow. Hi, Caleb. It's Mark from California, says Mr. Red. Hello, Mark. Glad you are with us. Glad you are with us. Jenny Lynn. I'm closer to Rockford, Illinois than any major Wisconsin city. Very good. Folks, I was asked about Tito. This actually reminds me of a rather humorous anecdote that was included in the autobiography of a communist African-American leader named Nelson Peary. So Nelson Peary, who was a communist activist from like the 50s up until, I think he died like a couple years ago, but longtime activist, told the story of after he came back from the Second World War, he joined the Communist Party of the United States. And in his autobiography, he tells the story of how, after the Second World War, the Communist Party changed quite a bit, right? They had been dissolved during the Second World War. Earl Browder had been the leader, and they reconstituted themselves. They became an anti-imperialist party once again. They repudiated a lot of what they had done during the war, and they had this anti-Browder campaign against Earl Browder, who was a leader, is asking Bernie Sanders' presidency. All right, written down. All right, and, he came back from the Second World War. They had reconstituted the Communist Party of the United States, and they were having a campaign against Browderism and revisionism, and making very clear that Earl Browder and the way he had conducted himself during the Second World War, supporting Japanese internment, supporting the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that violated communist principles, and that they were a revolutionary anti-imperialist party. So, 1948, the young Nelson Peary tells the story that he was at a conference of the Communist Party, and that they were passing resolutions, right? And they had a resolution to honor Josip Broz Tito, the leader of socialist Yugoslavia. And that, these resolutions were being passed. They'd have a resolution to oppose racism, unanimous. They'd have a resolution to oppose capitalism, unanimous. Resolution to support the Soviet Union, unanimous. So they had a resolution to support Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia. So they're getting ready to pass the resolution, and Nelson Piri tells the story of raising his hand. Tommy, got it already on the list, but I will definitely. All right. And he raises his hand, and he says, yes, I've been reading some of Josip Broz Tito's writings, and I feel like Josip Broz Tito is a revisionist. I feel like he's almost a lot like Browder, like Earl Browder. He's a Browderite revisionist. Some of what Josip Broz Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, is saying is actually Browderite revisionism. The room went silent. And there was this awkward silence in the room. And then they passed the resolution unanimously. So then they took the young Nelson Piri aside and they said, Nelson, we don't really think the party is right for you. You don't really get what the Communist Party is about, But then the next morning, the Daily Worker was delivered, and the headline was, Stalin denounces Tito. And so they pretended as if nothing had happened, and they erased their resolution supporting Tito. That's the anecdote, right? And Nelson Piri uses that anecdote to point out how one of the problems that the Communist Party USA had in its stronger years was that it had this very authoritarian culture, and it was kind of a culture of conformity where people were afraid to really speak their opinions. And 1948 was the year that Yugoslavia really became the first socialist country to cut ties with the Soviet Union. Josip Broz Tito denounced the Soviet Union and essentially aligned with the United States against the Soviet Union. 1948, Tito denounced the Soviet Union, called the Soviets an empire, okay, written down, Adam, thank you, called the Soviets an empire, aligned with the United States, and during the Second World War, during the Korean War, at that point, Tito took the same side as the United States and opposed North Korea and opposed China and the Soviet Union and actually sided with the United States in the Korean War. That was Tito. The other thing was that Tito, he introduced a different economic model. Instead of all the industries being centralized around the state, like in the Soviet Union, he had every factory function in kind of an autonomous way, right? The factories were like independent cooperatives that sold their goods to the state. And he did it that way. And Tito tried to present himself as if he was more revolutionary than the Soviet Union. And what's amusing is that a lot of Trotskyites loved Yugoslavia. And there was a whole number of Trotskyites in the 1950s who were going to Yugoslavia and saying that Yugoslavia was more socialist and more revolutionary than the Soviet Union. But at the end of the day, Yugoslavia's economic model, it was a little bit weaker than the Soviet economic model. I mean, it still had prosperity, right? I mean, they still guaranteed employment, but there was a lot more inequality because some regions were more prosperous than others. It was more efficient to have a centralized 5-year economic plan than it was to have every factory be autonomous. And that this factory autonomy theory that Tito introduced, people saw it as being more radical and more socialist than the Soviet Union. But in practice, it actually made Yugoslavia somewhat economically weaker than the Soviet Union. It's particularly interesting. Now, socialist Yugoslavia had real economic successes. And when socialism was destroyed in Yugoslavia, the overthrow of socialism, the division of Yugoslavia, the national, fighting that went on between different ethnicities and the ongoing ethnic wars in the Balkans, that whole thing was pretty horrendous. You can go down the line. And the way the United States intervened in Yugoslavia, the way Clinton, launched that NATO bombing campaign, supposedly a humanitarian operation, when at the same time the United States was supporting people that committed horrendous atrocities. the way socialist Yugoslavia was destroyed was pretty horrendous. And it shows that you can be aligned with the United States against the other socialist countries, but they still fundamentally don't care, right? I mean, at the end of the day, any socialist economy is going to be a target. So it's particularly interesting. Yeah, I mean, what I also think is interesting is that a lot of Trotskyites embraced Yugoslavia, but at the end of the day, they kind of backed away from that, right? There was a weird moment in Trotskyism in the post World War II era where you had Michel Pablo, who was the leader of Trotskyists in Greece, I believe, arguing that the Soviet Union was becoming in line with Leon Trotsky's teachings because of the Second World War. You know, a lot of things were happening at that time, and Tito was in no way a Trotskyite. And that is what Grant Jarvis is pointing out, and he's right. A lot of Trotskyists kind of had an illusion that he might be. But essentially, right, he broke with it. Now, Stanley Stan Lin is talking about how Gillis, who was aligned with Tito, wrote this book called The New Class, which became like a staple of anti-communist propaganda. That book was taught in school. That book became a central thesis during the Cold War. And it was a book basically arguing that socialism, all right, Jacob Maxey, neo-Ottomanism. Arguing that book essentially arguing that the Soviet Union and the socialist countries were a reintroduction of feudalism, and that there was this new class of state bureaucrats, and a lot of Trotskyites kind of clung to that kind of rhetoric. And let's remember that not only did Tito suppress open capitalists in Yugoslavia like Gillis, but on top of that he also suppressed pro-Stalin folks in Yugoslavia, and that there were prison camps. I mean, there was a mass repression of people in Yugoslavia who defended Stalin and defended the Soviet Union, right? The Tito government, they took their independent line, for which they were embraced by the United States and condemned by the Soviet Union. One thing that the Albanians always like to point out, it's pointed out over and over and over again in this book. Where do I have the book here? I have it somewhere. Yeah, in this book, if you read the history of the Party of Labor of Albania, the one point that Enver Hoxha's party, I don't know if this was personally written by Enver Hoxha, but it was written by the Communist Party, or the Labor Party of Albania, the Party of Labor of Albania. One point that they make over and over again is that originally the Soviet Union wanted Albania to be part of Yugoslavia, and so Enver Hoxha wrote an entire book with Stalin. I think I might have that somewhere. Just explaining over and over again that Albanians are not Slavs, they are an independent nationality, and that they are not part of Yugoslavia. And that whatever Yugoslavia took this line of they were, hostile to Stalin, hostile to the Soviet Union, aligning with the United States. Albania, after the death of Stalin, doubled down and said that they were the true Stalinists. And what has widely been pointed out, what's repeatedly pointed out throughout this book, is that Khrushchev, cut off relations with Albania, was just vicious to Albania, right? Because they aligned with China and they denounced the Soviet leaders as revisionists. But Khrushchev desperately begged and just groveled before Tito. And Khrushchev was desperate to restore relations with Yugoslavia and was just nasty and had no interest in being friendly toward Albania. And that, Albania and Yugoslavia, they have a whole history of not getting along. We know that later, right in the 90s, the United States and Saudi Arabia were training Wahhabi extremists who were part of the Kosovo Liberation Army, and it was ethnic Albanians who had moved into Serbia, into a region of Serbia called Kosovo, and were carrying out acts of terrorism, and that was a whole thing, right? And that, if you read With Stalin by Enver Hoxha, the entire book seems to be dedicated to showing how Enver Hoxha convinced Stalin that Albanians are not Slavs, which I think is fascinating. Fascinating stuff, right? And that, that Albania is historically about half Christian and half Muslim, and that's why Albania historically was the only quote-unquote atheist country in the world. The socialist countries officially had no state religion. Their official, the Communist Party was preaching atheism, but they officially had a separation of church and state, and they had no state religion, whereas Albania declared atheism to be the state religion. And probably the motivation for Albania to do that was the fact that they were divided between Christians and Muslims almost down the middle, and that it was an attempt to unify the country by getting rid of this very big difference. And I've talked to many Albanians who did live under Enver Hoxha, and one thing that they point out is that in some of the Muslim areas of Albania, they actually, even though they outlawed religion, and even though there was this huge crackdown on religion in Albania, they did, keep intact some of the more traditional aspects of the Islamic society. Like they were really strict about dress codes and not having women, walk around outside without their heads covered and things like that. And then in Muslim regions, there were big efforts to kind of respect the culture while outlawing the Islamic religion, which I think is interesting. And what's also interesting is that at this point, right, Albania remains about half Christian and half Muslim. But Albania now has become the headquarters of the Mujahideen Khalq, which is the fanatical anti-Iranian group, the faction within the Islamic, they were originally part of the Islamic Revolution, and they were Islamo-Marxists and whatever, and now they work with the USA and Israel to destabilize Iran and carry out assassinations. The MEK, all of their members at this point live in Albania, right? And it's very wild. I think that's pretty crazy. So a lot of interesting history there. You asked about Yugoslavia, and I'm telling you about that and how Yugoslavia was broken apart. And, you read about Serbia and the way Bill Clinton lied and lied and lied and lied. The world was convinced that the USA was bombing Yugoslavia to stop a genocide, when in reality that was not what was occurring. They had this photo of a man who was very skinny standing next to a fence, and you got the impression it looked like a Holocaust photo. This very famous photo from Serbia, right, of this Kosovoan Albanian man standing next to a fence. But if you actually look further, he's not behind the fence is just there. And he's really skinny because he has a disease. He's not really skinny because everyone around him is starving and it's the Holocaust, right? I mean, it was a really slick media campaign to convince the world that the United States had to intervene in Yugoslavia. And now, we have, at this point, the UN coming forward and saying, yes, there was no genocide. There was no genocide. Were there atrocities committed by Serbian soldiers? Of course. But was there genocide in Serbia? No. Right? Milosevic never, stood trial. He gave his opening statement and then he dies in prison, right? And that the U.S. military intervention in Serbia, right, and that NATO intervention was done on fraudulent basis. And what happened? Not only did Bill Clinton destroy, some of the most beautiful ancient churches in Serbia, not only were many, many civilians killed, but in addition to that, just to add it up, just to put it on top of that, addition to that, they bombed the Chinese embassy in Serbia. And they originally said it was an accident, but it was not an accident. It was done intentionally because the U.S. government was trying to send a message to China that they shouldn't support Serbia and they shouldn't support whatever remained of socialist Yugoslavia. Very horrendous stuff. The way Yugoslavia was banned from the United Nations, even though they were a founding member state, how they were forced out. That was the 1990s, before Russia had kind of have reasserted its independence. And, it was the age of neoliberalism. And, George Soros, right? I mean, he eventually, out of what happened in Yugoslavia, he moved toward establishing the International Criminal Court, the ICC, right? The International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia laid the basis for establishing the International Criminal Court, right? Which is one of the key globalist institutions that George Soros was key in setting up, right? That was when neoliberalism was running rampant all across Eastern Europe. You had the U.S. government funding all kinds of neo-Nazi fascist people all across Eastern Europe, a rise in just fascist hate crimes, communists being killed, utter chaos amid the restoration of capitalism. The 1990s were not a good time. And if you look at what's happened to Yugoslavia since the overthrow of socialism, I mean, it's been quite a disaster. So I hope that answers the question about Titoism. Michael Parenti, that's right, has a great book, To Kill a Nation. I strongly recommend Michael Parenti's book, To Kill a Nation. You can listen to some of Michael Parenti's lectures on Yugoslavia Yugoslavia. Very, very good stuff. Very, very good stuff. And the NATO bombing campaign against Yugoslavia was not justified in any way. And that Tito, yes, I don't agree with his geopolitical positions and how he was anti-Soviet, but the overall, the socialist system in Yugoslavia, despite its flaws, despite it not being as strong as Soviet socialism or Chinese socialism, it had its strengths, and I mean, it provided employment. And I have met people, right, who are right-wing anti-communist Serbians in the United States that will say life was much better in Yugoslavia. I also heard a very interesting anecdote one time. This is how I'll end the Yugoslavia thing, because we've got plenty more to talk about. I heard a very interesting anecdote about there was a guy, a friend of mine, and he was in the east side of Cleveland at one point, and he was in a hardware store. And he was in a hardware store on the east side of Cleveland. There's a lot of Eastern European folks in the east side of Cleveland. And he said something about how the government should guarantee health care to the population. We should give free health care to people. And the man behind the counter said, "That's a bunch of Serbian propaganda." Right? Well, this man was from Croatia or wherever, and communism was identified with Serbs, right? And so the man said to him when he was advocating guaranteed health care, just kind of like Bernie Sanders stuff, we ought to have socialized medicine or whatever, the man behind the counter said, "That's Serbian propaganda," because you have to remember, right, at the time in the 1990s when socialism was falling across Eastern Europe, these things were explained in ethnic ways. And communism was labeled in a lot of different, Yugoslavian ethnicities as Serbian. Very fascinating stuff. So, folks, I was asked another super chat by Sami, and he asked about Edward Said's Orientalism. I have read that book. Edward Said is a very famous scholar of Middle Eastern history, and his book, Orientalism, it basically describes how people in the West view people in the Middle East and how they project their own political ideas, their own culture onto people in the Middle East. And it talks about, for example, in the 50s, from like the 1800s up into the 50s, 60s, even up into the 70s, the stereotype of Middle Eastern people was that they were all sexual perverts, right? That's not the stereotype we have now. We think that they're all, very, very religious, devout people who, don't allow women to wear clothing that they desire or something, and are really, really strict and all of that. That's the stereotype now. The stereotype now is the opposite. But it's true that up until the rise of I think up until the Iranian Revolution, the stereotype of Middle Easterners was that they were all wild sexual people, and that there was all kinds of pornography and all of that. And there was even an Elvis movie called Harem Scarum. And it was a big hit movie where Elvis goes to the Middle East, and I mean, it's pretty wild. And the stereotype of Middle Easterners was they were all wild sexual people. Well, they weren't, but this was a projection, right? And just like now, Middle Eastern people, you say they're all religious fanatics. Well, they're not, but that's a projection, right? And the point of Edward Said's book Orientalism is that the way the Middle East is portrayed in the West, the way it's portrayed is very much a reflection of the West itself. And he gives many examples of that. He talks about paintings. He talks about Thomas Edward Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, the very famous, British intelligence officer who led the Arab revolt during World War I against the Ottoman Empire. Fascinating stuff. So yeah, I think it's a good book. It's a good history of how Americans see, the way Americans see Middle Easterners, the way the West portrays Middle Easterners and its culture and such. It's a very good book. It's been years since I've read it, but it's worth looking into. So I was asked about Bernie as president by Tommy Farras, I believe. No, Tommy Farras asked about Cuba. Someone else asked me about Bernie as president. Well, Bernie as president. Okay, here's the thing. I have said this, right? Bernie Sanders as president of the United States. Sounds great, right? I mean, somebody in the White House who has a history of believing in socialism, somebody in the White House who wants everyone to have health care and wants everyone to have education and talks about the billionaire class. But, I first of all, I don't endorse any candidate. And I very much disagree with a lot of what Bernie Sanders says about foreign policy. Let me be absolutely clear about that, number one. Number two, so I don't endorse Bernie Sanders. And I mean, there are things he says that I strongly agree with. There are things he says I don't agree with, especially about foreign policy. But let me also add that if Bernie Sanders were elected and he took office and he did not deliver, and the population did not see significant increases in their living standards, if they didn't get their free health care, if they didn't get their free education, if student debt didn't get canceled, if Bernie got in and was unable to deliver, that could have the opposite effect. That could actually make socialism weaker than ever and strengthen the forces of political reaction in the United States. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? Bernie Sanders' presidency is a question of what he could actually accomplish, right? That is the issue. And that's really what it gets down to, right? What could he actually accomplish? And if he was able to accomplish a lot, Roosevelt, not a socialist, not a leftist, but he was able to accomplish a huge amount. And because of that, the left got stronger. The Communist Party, the socialist movements got stronger. On top of that, he was loved. He was unstoppable. He was the longest term, president in office we've ever had, 4 terms, and then he died. He would have kept getting reelected until he died. They imposed term limits. Roosevelt would have just kept getting reelected. He was like a household name. Of course he was a household name. He was the president, but he was loved. I mean, he had this devotion. Americans looked up to Roosevelt in a very, very fanatical way because of what he accomplished in terms of Social Security, in terms of the Works Progress Administration, and it's about what he did. Right? And the left and the socialist and communist groups got way stronger during the Roosevelt presidency because what was being accomplished by the Roosevelt coalition, with the Communist Party being a big part of it. Roosevelt didn't agree with communism, didn't agree with socialism, but the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the CIO unions, they were a big part of Roosevelt's presidency. And thank you to you, Paula, and good luck on the work that you're doing. It was the Roosevelt presidency was loved because of what was accomplished. Let's be real about that. And that's the same for Bernie Sanders, right? It will be more about what he does, not what he says. Let's be real about that. The Obama presidency, Obama said a lot. Obama really knew how to get up and give a speech that made everyone cry. More Perfect Union speech, his Cairo speech. Obama was so good at getting up and making everybody cry. But at the end of the day, was the country better off because of the Obama presidency? Think about it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, Obama was a great speech maker, but is the country any better off, right? I mean, some people say, okay, well, healthcare because of pre-existing conditions. Okay, well, I'd rather that people not be blocked from pre-existing conditions. But that's about, can you point to anything else? I mean, Libya, Syria, he came in with the promise that he was going to, the hope of the Obama presidency was that racial injustice in the United States would be curbed, right? And that there would be harmony between black and white in the United States, and that the police state, which was coming down on African Americans, would be, lessened. And that clearly didn't happen. And the Baltimore, rebellion, if you want to call it that, the huge uprising that swept the city of Baltimore, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Trayvon Martin situation, that all happened. That all happened because of the disappointment around Barack Obama, because many people expected that Barack Obama would improve these situations, and he didn't, right? And then the Trump administration, talk about, quote unquote, a lot of people talk about white backlash and all of that. It's I'm just telling you, right? If many people believed that Obama getting into office would make things better in terms of race relations in the United States, that clearly didn't happen. Clearly the opposite happened. Many people believed that Obama taking office would make things better in terms of health care. Didn't happen. Now, it's not so much a question of what a leader says, it's what they do. And that's why I have emphasized the slogan, we need a government of action to fight for working families. A government of action to fight for working families. A government of action. Action is key. What does the government actually get done? Not what do they say, not what nice books do they wrote, not what nice speeches they give, but what will the government actually accomplish? And if Bernie Sanders is elected and accomplishes nothing, we're in big trouble. And if Bernie Sanders is elected, or, I mean, who knows? If Pete Buttigieg is elected, and I mean, who knows, right? If some Republican is elected, and they're in a situation where they're mobilizing the working class and entering an alliance with progressive forces, and they're getting things done, that's a very good situation, right? It's more about the balance of class forces. It's more about what's actually getting done. It's about what's actually accomplished, right? I mean, the Roosevelt presidency. Roosevelt definitely did not call himself a socialist. No president has ever accomplished so much for the left, and never has socialists and leftists been so strong as since they were during the Roosevelt years, right? That was because of an alignment of class forces. I actually was going to hold this up later. But, I've told you folks, people always read the wrong stuff. I went to college. And I remember I went to the university library, and I said to the university librarian, I said, "Do you have anything by Earl Browder?" And he looked at me really funny. And he said, "Caleb, young people your age who get into socialism, they get into bell hooks, not Earl Browder." But as a college student, I read old 1930s communist literature. And one of those pamphlets, and Earl Browder, I've done whole videos critiquing Browderism, but he did write this very interesting, if you want to know what the Communist Party USA thought in 1936, there's this interesting little book, What is Communism, by Earl Browder. And, see, it costs 50 cents. And this is, it's falling apart here, but Amazon.com, and it's a compilation of little essays that Earl Browder wrote to explain the political position of the Communist Party in 1936, in the year that Roosevelt was reelected, at the time of what they call the Popular Front. And you read it, and it's interesting, right? I mean, we can all be critical of Browderism. There's certainly plenty in here I don't agree with. But what I thought was amusing, right, is, the first chapter of the book, the very first chapter of the book of What is Communism, the first chapter of the book is called Who Are the Americans? And it's an essay that Earl Browder writes, making the point that the communists are the most patriotic people in the entire history of the USA. Right? It's wild that they are the most patriotic, right? That they continues the greatest figures of American history. If Abraham Lincoln and Washington were alive today, they would be the communists. They would be members of the Communist Party. We are the Americans, and communism is 20th century Americanism. Fascinating stuff, right? But what I also thought was interesting is if you read the chapter on religion, right? He has a whole chapter, What About Religion? And in it, he explains what was the position of the Communist Party, which was that they were an atheist organization. They believed in dialectical materialism. However, what is fascinating is he spends an entire few pages talking about Father Divine. I don't know if people know who Father Divine is, but Father Divine was an African-American minister in Harlem. And he spends pages in here defending the fact that the Communist Party had a relationship with Father Divine, who was this well-known African-American civil rights leader who was a minister, who was being considered even by other African-American ministers to be the leader of a cult. And he explains that the Communist Party in Harlem, in New York City, Harlem, had a very close relationship with Father Divine. He writes, this aim clears up a question much discussed by critics of the communists, namely, our united front activities with the followers of self-styled God of Harlem, Father Divine. It is significant that most of the people who criticize us for associating with Father Divine and the members of his church are willing enough to permit us to have united activities with more, quote, respectable church organizations. In other words, they demand that we should be discriminating, and that we should not associate ourselves with bad religions, but with only good ones. They are especially outraged by the fact that Father Divine's followers place their God on 115th Street in Harlem instead of in the more romantic regions of heavenly ferment. Their sense of decorum is outraged because Father Divine's flock loudly demonstrates its religious enthusiasm in the streets and not quietly behind stained glass windows. But these critics do not understand that we communists do not distinguish between good and bad religions, because we think that they are all bad for the masses. We are not interested in the exact location of God's residence or in the enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm in religious worship. We judge religious organizations and their leaders by their attitude to the fundamental and social issues of the day. What church organization has so completely demonstrated its opposition to fascism and war as much as Father Divine? Other churches could very well follow his example. We would be delighted if thousands of other churches would support the workers' insurance bill, fight for the freedom of the Scottsboro Boys, and would fight against Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, as the followers of Father Divine have done. It is especially important that we bring our United Front program to the Negro masses, where there is great suffering and oppression, and where there has been a great response to our message of organization and struggle. Our activity is gradually succeeding in giving social and political education to Negro men and women who belong to Father Divine's church. Fascinating, right? So, in the same essay where Earl Browder is saying that communists don't believe in religion, he's defending the Communist Party's relationship with Father Divine, this very, very well-known black minister who was very anti-fascist and anti-imperialist. Fascinating stuff, you know? And again, I'm not telling you that I agree with everything in this book. I'm just telling you that this book, if you want to know what the Communist Party's attitude was toward Franklin Roosevelt, if you want to know their attitude toward Huey Long, right? There's a whole chapter here on the assassination of Huey Long. You know, if you want to know how they saw things, this is the voice of a mass organization. This is not the voice of an academic. Earl Browder, I mean, the Communist Party was hundreds of thousands of people in these times, right? And they ran in national elections, got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of votes. And it's fascinating stuff. And again, if Bernie Sanders were to be elected, we ought to be studying how the Communist Party functioned during the time of the presidency of Roosevelt, right? The Communist Party was part of the Roosevelt coalition. And would socialists and communists in the United States be part of a Bernie Sanders coalition, right? That would be an issue that they should discuss, right? And some people argue, when Roosevelt first took office, the communists called him a fascist. They wanted nothing to do with him. They spoke of him in very harsh terms, but things changed, right? In 1934, 35, after the mass strike wave, after the attempted military coup against Roosevelt, the business plot, the communists viewed Roosevelt very, very differently. This is fascinating. This is a fascinating piece of history. I thought I'd fit it in there with the Bernie Sanders question. All right, so Tommy Farras is asking about Cuba, and that was already on my list of things to talk about. So thank you, Tommy. I'm going to address your question. Tommy, you asked about Cuba. And let me just say this. The way Bernie Sanders has been treated as if he committed a crime for his statements about Cuba shows how ridiculous U.S. media is. It shows how brainwashed so much of the U.S. public is. Folks, Bernie Sanders has said horrible things about the Cuban government. And he says horrible things about the Cuban government. He denounces them. He repeats things against them that are not true. He says things about Cuba that are just downright wrong. That's not enough. The quote that they just won't let go from Bernie Sanders that he said about Cuba is, "It's unfair to say that everything was bad." It's unfair to say that everything was bad. Folks, Cuban socialism has created a healthcare system that is the model of the world. Read what people in the United Nations have said about it. Ban Ki-moon said that their medical university was the greatest in the world. Their life expectancy is about on the same level as the United States, despite being a historically impoverished country, a Caribbean island. Their infant mortality rate is very low. Their literacy, they've wiped out illiteracy. They have industrialized the island and brought factory production. They've electrified the island. The Cuban government has accomplished huge things for the people of Cuba, despite the fact that they're subject to a blockade. And they still, their medical aid that they provide all over the world. People know Cuba. If you go to African countries, people know African people know Cuban doctors that give them medical aid. No country exports more medical aid than Cuba does. Cuba sends its doctors all over the world. Furthermore, Cuba It's literacy volunteers. Go all over the world, all kinds of countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America. You have Cuban literacy volunteers who are teaching people how to read, and they have it down to a skill. I mean, for a Caribbean island, right? Cuba is doing pretty well. Compare Cuba to Haiti. Compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic. Compare Cuba to Jamaica. Compare Cuba to the countries of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, right? There are whole parts of Guatemala where the population does not speak Spanish. It speaks only the indigenous language. They have never gotten literacy in the Spanish language. Where people live in huts, where people have never had electricity, never had it, never had running water, where people are living about the level, and on some level, people say they live actually slightly worse than before the Spanish colonialists came, right? You go to Honduras, right? Go to parts of Honduras where people are living in just utter destitute poverty and misery. Every Cuban has electricity. Every Cuban has running water. Every Cuban is literate. Education is guaranteed, right? The country is fully electrified. They have done astounding things for their population. But you're not allowed to say that on American television, right? It's not enough that Bernie Sanders repeats extreme allegations against the Cuban government. It's not enough. It is not enough that Bernie Sanders, denounces them. He has said, quote, "It's unfair to say that everything is bad, and they won't let it go. How dare he? How dare he?" Meanwhile, President Donald Trump, President Barack Obama, President George W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, every president we've had since 1945 has praised the Saudi monarchy. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world where they still cut people's heads off in public. People get beheaded in Saudi Arabia for insulting the king. People get beheaded in Saudi Arabia for crimes like sorcery. If you were doing something religious and the government doesn't approve, they cut your head off. About a third of the country are guest worker slaves that have no rights, and they disappear and get tortured, and nothing happens to them. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen and killing thousands of people. You can go down the line. Saudi Arabia, this huge oil plantation run by ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. Horrendous regime. And every president we've had since World War II has bent over backwards to praise them. That's fine. But Bernie Sanders said in regards to Cuba, quote, "It's unfair to say everything is bad." And he is being condemned and raked over the coals and treated like he's committed an unforgivable crime. U.S. media is propaganda, folks. I don't see them holding anyone accountable for their praise of the Saudi autocracy. But how dare anyone praise Cuba? Hating Fidel Castro is like the religion of the United States. It is your responsibility. If you're going to be president of the United States, you cannot say anything good about Cuba. It's wild. It is absolutely wild. And let me add on top of that, on top of this, on top of all of that, right? At this point, right? At this point, Bernie Sanders has denounced Cuba. He has said things that I don't agree with about Cuba. That's not enough. This is shocking. You should be blown away by this, right? In Cuba, Cuban government officials, Cuban members of parliament, Cuban college professors, Cuban academics get up and praise the American capitalist system all the time. It is perfectly fine in Cuba to say that American capitalism has had big achievements. It is perfectly fine in Cuba to get up and say that, the Americans have a very efficient system of production. In Cuba, it is perfectly acceptable to point out the strengths of the American system while criticizing its flaws. In the United States, you are not allowed to say, quote, "It's unfair to say everything is bad about Cuba." Now, which system is totalitarian? I'm telling you, folks, if you say that it's unfair, as Bernie says, quote, "It's unfair to say that everything is bad about Cuba," that is considered grounds for you not being fit for office. That is the argument, that if you say that it's unfair to say everything is bad about Cuba, you are unfit to be president of the United States. People in Cuba praise American capitalism all the time. People in Vietnam praise American capitalism all the time. People in Venezuela praise American capitalism all the time. People in China praise... In all the countries of the world that are supposed to be authoritarian, totalitarian states, members of the government are allowed to praise the American system. But in the United States, you cannot praise the Cuban system. It's unacceptable. This is ridiculous, right? And this shows how much the U.S. media and how much the anti-communist, what do you want to call it, the anti-communist paradigm, how basically the party line in the United States is that you must hate the Cuban government, and that's all you're allowed to do, right? When Barack Obama was in Cuba, he actually said a lot of good things about the Cuban system. I mean, he wasn't running for re-election at that point, but that's a whole nother story. And I'm actually curious about Ben Rhodes. Ben Rhodes was really the author of the U.S., rapprochement with Cuba under Barack Obama, most of which has been eroded by Trump. And I think Ben Rhodes is a very interesting person. And I'm doing some research about Ben Rhodes. I think he's quite interesting. But that's a whole nother story. All right. I hope that answers Tommy Farras's question. All right. So Duterte. When Duterte first got elected, I was very excited, right? Because we know that Duterte had the support of a lot of socialists and leftists in the Philippines. The Philippines has been, a U.S. client state for a long time. The people of the Philippines have suffered. They were, the Philippines was a U.S. territory, right? The USA seized the Philippines from Spain. There was a genocide, murderous civil, war against the Filipino people as they were fighting for their independence prior to World War I. From 1901 to 1914, there was a war in the Philippines where hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed. We know that there were U.S. atrocities against the Filipino people during the Second World War. We know, even, in the Marcos regime that the United States backed, the authoritarian, Bonapartist, regime that horrendously murdered people. There have been all kinds of things that were done, and that when Duterte was on the road to taking office, he'd been the mayor of a city, and he'd been aligned with anti-drug vigilante groups. And in U.S. media, they tried to portray him as a fascist. And I wrote an article called Drugs, Duterte, and the Nature of Imperialism. And I pointed out that actually Duterte is more like Bernie Sanders than like Trump, and that he was more of a leftist, right? And that in the developing world, anti-drug vigilantism is associated with the left, right? The Black Panthers in the United States killed heroin dealers. That was one thing that they were known for doing. And, that in the Philippines, fighting against drug dealers is often seen as very working class and often is very progressive. And that Duterte wanted to, be friendlier to China, and he wasn't going to, he's a complicated figure, and he talked about a peace deal with, with the Maoists, with the rebel groups, right? There's the insurgency going on there, and he talked about a peace deal. And many people were very, very optimistic. And what's funny is that article that I wrote, Drugs, Duterte, and the Nature of Imperialism, was republished by InfoWars, right? Alex Jones liked my article and published it on his website. I originally wrote it for New Eastern Outlook. Alex Jones decided to republish it. And it's one of my better articles. And I go over the issue of drugs and anti-drug vigilantism, and I thought it was good. Now, after Duterte got elected, there was a huge explosion of extrajudicial killings where a lot of people were killed without trial, over drug stuff. I don't agree with that, obviously. And a lot of the communists and leftists who had supported Duterte originally protested that wave of killings. But at the same time, Duterte, when it comes to the South China Sea, he's not fully in the pocket of the United States. Duterte represents a faction within the Filipino ruling class that is more open to being friendly with China and isn't just completely comprador with the United States, right? That China has invested a lot in the Philippines, and the Philippines has gained a new level of economic independence, mainly because of Chinese investment. And because of that, they have, their own capitalist class at this point. And that capitalist class is not completely, isn't just completely a comprador for the United States. They're saying to the United States, well, hey, maybe China can make us a better deal. And Duterte is a lot like Erdogan, and he's a lot like Modi in India. These are leaders that are not socialists, not revolutionaries, But they're also not puppets of the United States. They're Bonapartists. They're bourgeois nationalists, right? And they'll go with whoever makes them the best deal. If the USA makes them a good deal, they're with the United States. If China and Russia make them a good deal, they're with China and Russia. They can go either way. And it depends. Whoever makes them the best deal, what they think is in their own interest. They represent their own faction. They are bourgeois nationalists. Duterte is a bourgeois nationalist, right? And I believe he took power in alliance with a lot of progressive folks. And then at the same time, now he's been quite, repressive to them. It's a back and forth, right? He is a figure who, represents a faction within the Filipino ruling class. And that faction within the Filipino ruling class is trying to assert its will over other factions. Same for India, right? Modi represents a faction within the ruling class of India that's trying to assert its will over other factions. And that faction could make a deal with the United States, or it could make a deal with Russia and China, depending on who makes them the best deal, right? And that a lot of times, let's be fair, right? Bolivarianism and socialism in Latin America began as a Bonapartist struggle within the ruling class that transformed into socialism. And that happens a lot. You'll get a leader who's elected as kind of a Bonapartist representing one faction, but the workers are brought into motion and things change. In India, with Modi, certainly didn't happen, right? He was never open to that. He's not a friend of the trade unions, not a friend of the left, never was. In Turkey, certainly didn't happen, and many were hoping that it would happen with Duterte because he called himself a socialist when he ran for office. He was aligned with some progressive forces, but didn't happen, But maybe it will. I mean, who's to say what could happen? At this point, Duterte seems like a bourgeois nationalist. Sometimes he's with Trump, sometimes he's with China and Russia, and we shall see. Has he done some good things in the country? Sure. Has he done some other things in the country? Sure. Has he said all kinds of crazy things? Yep. So there you go. I hope that answers the question about Duterte. Neo-Ottomanism, right? Quite interesting. Now, Turkey, as we understand it, right, the current Turkish state is the result of Kemal Ataturk. Kemal Ataturk was a Turkish nationalist, was very opposed to any religious government, was kind of a nationalist, created the modern Turkish state. But then we also know there's a history of military dictatorships in Turkey backed by the United States, but that Erdogan took power as a somewhat religious leader, and that Turkey had a long history of suppressing any religious organization. They did not like any Islamic organization or whatever, and that Erdogan took power in an alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood and with Gulen, right? With Gulen, or Gulen, right? Who was this cleric, right? And he took power in alliance with these very, very religious Muslim Brotherhood kind of forces, right? And however, Gulen and Erdogan had a falling out, and Gulen is now in the United States. Gulen is now in the United States, and, there was an attempted coup against him by supporters of Gulen, and that Erdogan, was very much Muslim Brotherhood, very much a Turkish nationalist, but Erdogan is also kind of like Modi, kind of like Duterte. He does his own thing, and there are times where he makes a better deal with Russia, and there are other times where he makes a better deal with the United States. And let's also point out that Turkey is violating the territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. They have never been allowed to send their troops there, but they have sent troops and forces into Syria. And they've been backing insurgent groups in Syria since the beginning of the war. So it's complicated. It's a complicated situation, but, Erdogan is a leader who has made alliances with the United States for a long time. He's a member of NATO, right? Turkey is a member of NATO. It's a NATO state. But at the same time, there have been times where it's very clear, that coup attempt against Gulen, it was pretty clear the White House, it seems a lot like the U.S. government was trying to remove Erdogan, right? And that this was a coup attempt to remove Erdogan because they didn't see him as valuable. And the USA, at this point, holds Gulen, the fanatical cleric who brought Erdogan to power, essentially. So it's a very complex situation. I hope that answers that question as well. All right, folks, wow, I hope I just buzzed through those super chats and answered all those questions. Now, folks, I see people talking about it in the comment section, and I was going to address it. Somebody reached out to me, an individual by the name of Jay Dyer, and wanted me to debate him. And I'm not sure. You know, folks, it's interesting. So debates, folks. When I was a college student years ago, I was writing for the college newspaper. And I remember there was this conservative student who was writing responses to all of my articles, trying to like debunk my last article every week. And so, in the hopes of, just generating publicity or whatever, I challenged him to a debate. And so we had a public debate on the campus, and it was a great success. It was a great success. His fraternity packed the hall, all the local socialist activists in Cleveland packed in, and we had a debate. And, 2-hour discussion, it was a hit. I thought it was a very, very successful event. Many people watched it and were blown away. And, I thought it was one of the most successful things I'd done on that campus. My campus was not deeply political. But I noticed that with debates, a lot of times people think they're going to a boxing match or a dogfight, right? If it's like, come hear this person talk about socialism, no one wants to come. But come hear a debate between them, people think they're going to see a dogfight. I'm glad I did it. I had a great time doing it. What else? Thanks for the super chat, Boxbite. So then, fast forward about a decade. I debated a white nationalist, a man named Augustus Sol Invictus. Augustus Sol Invictus put on the internet that he wanted to debate an actual communist. So I went about debating Augustus Sol Invictus. And that was an experience, folks. I will tell you, that debate took a lot out of me in terms of resources, in terms of organizing it, right? Getting everything organized, in terms of security. Antifa really wanted to know the location of that debate so they could go in there and, beat the hell out of him. And his people are not the most fun to deal with. Let me put it that way. And it was a wild night. It was a pretty wild night. And then a month later was the whole Charlottesville incident, which he was a big part of. And, the video that came out, black and white, the music, some people find the music to be annoying, wasn't the best quality product, but overall it was a successful thing. And Julian Assange, who's now, facing extradition to the United States, Julian Assange tweeted it out and promoted it. He thought it was fascinating. He watched the debate and was blown away by it. Thought it was fascinating. And I will say, Augustus Invictus himself, you can read all about him. He's in jail now over, false kidnapping, and he's, he seemed just like a normal guy when I debated him. It was weird. It almost seemed like when he was performing, he was playing a character, because when he wasn't up in front of the audience, he lost his accent, and he just seemed like a normal guy to me. He had a female entourage who kind of came with him. That was interesting. And a lot of people thought I should not have done that debate with Augustus Sol Invictus. They said, Caleb, you're platforming a fascist. You're a fascist collaborator. A lot of hate on social media. Made me very nervous. But then, a few months later, I went to Berkeley, where there were all these protests against Milo Yiannopoulos. And what surprised me, was so many people came up to me, Antifa people in masks, and shook my hand and said, you're the guy who debated Invictus. You did a great job. Nobody, among this crowd of Antifa people that I was filming and all that, nobody, writing it down, reading list, nobody told me I shouldn't have done it. So I thought that was fascinating. What is your view on the current crisis in the world economy? You got it, Tom. You got it, Daniel Fox. Reading list, crisis in world economy. So I did that debate. It was a good thing. It was a stressful thing. I put a lot of my own resources and money into it, but I did it. Then more recently, I had a debate with Destiny Stephen Bonnell, the game streamer, and we did a debate. and that was pretty wild, but I did it from Skype, so I did it from like the seat I'm sitting in right now. And that was pretty wild. I mean, I thought it went very, very well. I would do it again. I would do that. And then more last week, I debated someone on a channel called Modern Day Debates. That went pretty well. So now this fellow Jay Dyer wants to debate me, and it seems like now, out of the blue, I'm getting all kinds of requests from people. Somebody who has a podcast called Adolf Stalin wanted me to come on their podcast. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go on a podcast called Adolf Stalin, right? There's way too much equating of communists with Nazis now, and just the name of the podcast makes me think, maybe you're trying to be ironic or something. I'm not going to go on a podcast with that name. I'm just not going to do it. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not saying you don't have good intentions, but it's just, I looked at the name of the podcast, Adolf Stalin, and I thought, not going to do that. Not going to do that. What else? I got an invite to go on a podcast here in New York City last week. Not going to say the name of it. And I was going to do it. And I listened to some of it, right? And it was a well put together, very high-tech podcast. But almost every episode kind of degenerated into the host, going on pro-Israeli rants. And he'd had a good friend of mine, a neighbor and a friend of mine, on the podcast a couple of weeks before. And I think that's how he heard about me. And that friend of mine is like a 9/11 truther. And so, there you go. So I was going to go on it. So then I started listening to the podcast, and they accused this friend of mine who had gone on the podcast a couple weeks prior. They accused him of being a Holocaust denier, even though he definitely didn't say that. And so I thought, this isn't for me. I mean, every episode ends up with the host on pro-Israeli rants. Plus, they slandered my friend. Now, they have apologized to him. But on the air, on this podcast, they accused my friend who had been on their show a few weeks ago of being a Holocaust denier, which is that's a really extreme thing to say. I canceled. I didn't do it, right? Will I debate Jay Dyer? Probably not. Maybe. I'm still open to it. I'm open to it, right? I'm open to having debates, right? I debated the executive director of the Libertarian Party. I debated Augustus Sol Invictus. Maybe I'll debate this Jay Dyer, but I'm looking at his channel, and most of his videos are about Hollywood satanic sex cults or something. Is that really worth my time? I mean, is it? I mean, should I? I mean, maybe I should. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. Do you ever do a Discord channel reading list? Well, I can just answer that straight up. I will give you a reading list later, but in terms of a Discord channel, I don't know how Discord works. I just don't, so I can't answer that. But thanks for the super chat. I don't know. I mean, if I can look into it, if someone can convince me that it would be worth doing to debate this guy who's talking about Hollywood sex, Satan cults and whatever, and maybe I would do it. But I'm focused, folks. I'm focused on the CPI conference, right? Down below is the conference. It's coming up. The Center for Political Innovation is launching on April 18th. Today, I went to New Jersey. I went to the hotel where it's happening with the camera crew, and we planned where the lights are going to be and everything. It's going to be really exciting. This hotel is going to be amazing, right? And I am going to give a great presentation at this conference, and I'm not the only one. People from all over the country are coming to this conference. There's a whole crew of people coming from Michigan to this conference. Shout out to those of you who are listening. There's a group of people coming from like South Carolina to this conference. There are people coming from Boston to this conference. There are people coming from Washington, D.C. There are people flying in from California, from Southern California, to attend this conference. Manar Muhawish, the editor of Mint Press News, is flying in to speak at the conference, right? Would you ever go on Chapo? Yes, I would happily go on Chapo Trop House. If I were invited, I would definitely go on Chapo. I would love to go on Chapo. This conference, the Center for Political Innovation conference, the launch conference for the think tank that I'm helping to establish, the CPI, is taking place April 18th. And that is my focus. I am organizing that conference. It is my focus. And between now and April 18th, I might do a debate here and there, but my focus is launching CPI because we need an institution that can provide socialist education. The issues that we talk about on these lives, on this podcast, are far, far, far more important than they have ever been. And that's why, folks, you need to hit the like button. You need to share this. Make this a bigger conversation. Bring your friends into this conversation. Build this live. There need to be more people watching this right now. Build this live, and let's have a big conference. If you miss this conference on April 18th, you're gonna be disappointed, because this is the beginning of something really, really good. This is really, really good. Thank you, Augie Hubbard. I really appreciate your encouraging words. But this is going to be a really, really important conference, right? I mean, there are some other big names that are possibly going to be there, right? Some other folks have just confirmed. Dr. Wilmer Leon of Sirius XM Radio, Urban View, he'll be attending and speaking, right? Randy Nord, the editor of Geopolitics Alert, she intends to be there as well. Some other folks are still tentative, not yet confirmed, but it looks good. Once they're confirmed, their names will be on the website, and it's very exciting, folks. I mean, some very, very exciting stuff is happening. So you really want to find your way to Weehawken, New Jersey on April 18th. Go down below right now, hit the link, and register. If you intend to be there, register. A very good number of people are registered already, right? And there are other people that are coming that are planning to register. So it's very exciting. I want you to be there, because there's nothing like being there. There's going to be music. There's going to be a folk singer who performs between the panels. There's going to be a stand-up comedian, very funny woman who's going to be there. Thank you, Herb Bryant, for the super chat. It's going to be an amazing experience. You will not regret attending the launch conference of the Center for Political Innovation on April 18th. If you miss it, you will be disappointed. You want to be there. Now, we're going to do one on the West Coast in the fall, but details about that are coming, not finalized yet. But this event on April 18th, I mean, unless the whole world dies of the coronavirus, is going to happen. And you want to be there. I mean, you really want to be there, because, folks, we are a community here, right? I mean, we all know each other, right? I mean, you all have your names. I read off the same names every week. This is like a community for us. Let's make it an IRL relationship, right? Let's make this not just a group of people who listen to the same guy drone on and on YouTube every weekend. Let's meet each other in person. Let's have fun. Let's get together. Let's build this community. Let's do it. Let's build this community. What do you suggest on how to pursue journalism? Well, Robert, see, my career trajectory is rather unorthodox. So I'm not the kind of person that you want to ask about that. But I'm proud of the work I do, and there you go. But there you go. And the main thing is, nowadays, and I will say this, nowadays, it's almost on you to prove yourself, right? Nowadays, you can set up a blog, you can set up a YouTube, you can start doing journalism. No big publication has to give you a platform. You can start proving your skills as a journalist right now, right? With social media, with a phone, you know what I mean? The ability to practice journalism and have other people see it has greatly expanded because of information technology. So if you want to prove that you are a good journalist, start doing it. That's my advice, right? And I know my history is rather unorthodox. I certainly didn't go to the Harvard School of Journalism, but I'm really proud of the work that I do. And again, if you want to go and do journalism, do it, right? In this day and age, start doing it. Start doing it, right? That's what I would have to say as far as that goes. Now, I did have a super chat, two super chats. So first, the reading list, right? The main book that I've always told people to read if they want to get interested in Marxism and socialism is they need to read The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, right? This book is key. If you want to understand Marxism, read The History of the Three Internationals. I would also recommend reading Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, which is the Soviet Communist Party's official textbook. Furthermore, I would recommend that you read the book that I wrote, because even, the William Z. Foster book, Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, the Soviet textbook, that's all very out of date. And you're still going to go, what the hell happened, between 1950 and today? You really ought to read my book. This book, the opening essay of this book, of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, it opens with an essay that's 110 pages long. And this essay explains what you need to know, right? What the hell happened with the 20th century? What's going on with China? What's going on with the Bolivarian countries? What the real difference between socialism and capitalism is? how socialism and Marxism fits in with world history, whether you want to talk about Julius Caesar or Socrates and the Academy of Athens and ancient Greece, you really ought to read this book, right? Because this is a view and analysis you will not get anywhere else. The reason that socialist and leftist groups are totally confused is they're holding on to beliefs that made sense 100 years ago. The world has changed. If you want to understand what socialism means in our time, you need to read my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. You really do. This book explains socialism for our time, right? And if you want to understand socialism, you really ought to get a copy of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. It's about to be translated into Italian. It's almost done. The Italian translation is almost done. The German translation is in the works. Spanish translation is also in the works. You really ought to get a copy. Hundreds of them have already sold. People are reading this all over the world. People are reading this book in Venezuela. I know that for a fact, right? There are Venezuelan government officials who have been studying this book, right? I've got a friend who goes to Venezuela a lot, and every time he goes, he brings, a whole, suitcase full of these books, and then he goes back, and they have notes about it, you know what I mean? People are reading this book in Iran right now. People are reading this book in Russia right now. People are reading this book in China right now. People are reading this book in Australia. I know for a fact that it's actually in a public library in Australia. People are reading this book all across the United States. Look at the reviews on Amazon.com. I mean, this book struck a chord. People read this and their eyes go big. This is not like anything you see anywhere else, right? I am very proud of this book. I put it out myself. I worked with a great friend of mine and with a great publishing firm, a new publishing firm. This is an exciting book. So if you really want to understand the world that we live in and Marxism in our time, you really ought to read City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. That's what I would recommend. So there you go. Okay, so now I'm going to get to Daniel Fox's very important question about the crisis in the world economy. Well, Paul is going to read it in Reno. Glad to hear it. So, folks, the world economy, the world economic crisis, the problem is this. David Fox, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I'm calling you Daniel. Your name is David. The problem is this, right? Production is carried out for profit, right? Production is carried out for profit. They don't build houses and under this system so that people can live in them. They build houses so that landlords and banks can make money. They don't make food under this system so that people can eat it. They make food so that agribusiness and big box stores can make money. And that results in a large amount of problems. For example, right, the cost of rent in New York City continues to go up, despite the fact that there are all kinds of empty housing units all over this city. And why is that? Well, it's because of real estate speculation. The way people who own buildings in New York City make money is not by people living in the building. They buy the building, and they wait for the property value to increase, and then they sell the building. That real estate and housing has been turned into the new stock market. It's a gambling casino. Donald Trump was key in getting all of this going, right? He was the big they call it real estate speculation, where you buy a building, you wait for the market to go up, and then you sell a building. And landlords can make lots of money by not providing any housing to people, right? There you go. Bankers make lots of money. This is a classic problem. You read old religious texts. Every major religion, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, forbids usury. And what is usury? It's lending money at interest, where essentially someone makes money by having money. Someone makes money by having money, right? When a bank loans you money and you pay it back, that bank makes money. But they didn't make anything. They didn't provide a service other than giving you money. They didn't build anything. They didn't create anything. They didn't do any human labor, but they make money because they had money and you needed money, and now they make more money, right? And this is a problem. But here is the essential aspect. Here is what's really the issue. And I've explained this before, and it's a very simplistic explanation of a big problem, a much more complex problem, but I'm going to explain it in very simple terms, right? Let's say that you're a factory owner, and you're making a product. So when you make your product, you're going to obviously have to, pay some workers to assemble the product. So that'll be your first cost. A is your first cost. That's the cost of labor. On top of that, you're going to have materials. There's going to be materials that are necessary for those workers to assemble. So that'll be B, will be your materials that are necessary, right? On top of that, you're going to need a profit margin, right? The capitalists, they're not making pencils and making, toys or whatever they're making because they feel like it. They want to make a profit. So you're going to need a profit margin. All of that is going to add up into D, which is the final cost of the product, right? Right? The cost is going to include the labor costs, it's going to include the material costs, and it's ultimately going to include the profit margin. That'll add up to the total cost of the product. Here's the problem. A, your labor cost, does not equal D. You are not paying the worker enough to buy the product, right? The amount paid to workers to engage in production is never enough to buy back the total product that they produce. Now, obviously, every worker in the factory doesn't want to buy every single pencil, but they need to buy other things from other factories. The worker is also the consumer, but the consumer is never paid enough to purchase the total cost of the product, right? This is a built-in problem in capitalism. The worker can never afford to buy back what he makes. Overproduction. And the problem gets even more intense, right? The capitalist is always trying to figure this out. This leads to the boom-bust cycle, right? Because eventually you're going to have a whole bunch of pencils that can't be sold, and that becomes even more intensified because the capitalist is constantly trying to reduce labor costs, right? He's constantly trying to reduce the total cost of labor by expanding the machine, right? The more technology is involved, the fewer workers you have. And the more technology is involved, the more easily replaceable those workers are. Those workers that you hire, if all they have to do is push a button, you don't have to train them. They're very easily replaceable. How many short order cooks are there these days, for example, right? If you go to a fast food restaurant, it's basically an assembly line, but instead of making cars, you're making hamburgers, right? They don't need years of training to be short order cooks. They don't need fancy chefs. They just boom, 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 you got a hamburger, right? Book binderies, for example. For years, I knew people who there'd be thousands of people that would be in one giant factory binding books all day. Nowadays, Amazon create a page, you push a button, and a book comes out, right? That workers are being eliminated by technology. And for the capitalist, that's great because they have to pay fewer people. The people they do pay, they pay them less, and so their profit margin expands. However, there's a problem. The same initial problem, A does not equal D, becomes intensified. Why? Because the less you pay these people, the less they're able to buy back the product that they produce. And that you'll notice that in the history of capitalism, all the greatest crises follow huge leaps in technological advancement. That World War I was preceded by all kinds of financial crises and panics. And what was causing all those financial crises and panics? It was breakthroughs in technology. Radios were being developed. All kinds of mechanical breakthroughs were happening, right? World War II was preceded by the Great Depression, right? 1929, the Great Depression. About a decade later, we had the Second World War. We had the rise of fascism in Europe. We had class struggle breaking out all across the Western world. The Soviet Union booming while the rest of the world is in decay. All of that eventually culminates in the Second World War. What caused the Great Depression? It was the fact that Henry Ford and Taylor basically had developed assembly line production. They had made production more efficient than ever before in the history of the world. It was more efficient to produce products than ever before. And so as a result, fewer people were ever hired. And all of a sudden you had poverty amid plenty, right? This is a built-in problem of capitalism, that the capitalist is always trying to make production as efficient as possible, and the worker can never buy back the product that he produces, right? And this is the built-in problem of capitalism that the capitalist cannot overcome, right? It is, as long as you have production for profit, you have this problem. The Federal Reserve System was developed in the United States as a mechanism for trying to abridge this crisis. Imperialism Imperialism is largely a need to dump excess products on international markets. If there's not enough workers in the United States to buy our cars, well, we need workers in China and we need workers in Korea to be buying our cars. Imperialism is largely driven by this problem of the need to dump excess commodities on international markets because the worker at home cannot afford to buy them. Right? That this is an inherent problem of capitalism. Albert Einstein, the great physicist, he wrote a beautiful essay called Why Socialism? In 1949, it was published, and he lays this out there. He describes the problem of overproduction. And capitalism leads to a system where you have poverty amid plenty, where huge amounts of goods are produced and people cannot afford to buy them. That is the inherent problem of capitalism. And the reason that we are facing a global economic crisis right now is because we have just experienced, over the course of the, really starting during the Second World War with Alan Turing's decoder machine, up into the 50s, 60s, up into the 70s with the huge breakthroughs with the rise of Silicon Valley, up into the 90s with the dot-com boom, and we have had one of the greatest technological advances in human history. The computer revolution is a complete game changer. Never before have capitalists been able to so effectively eliminate workers from production. With 3D printers, with artificial intelligence, we have basically entered a stage where, during Marx's day, Karl Marx, you read his pamphlets, he's always talking about the fact that the worker goes from being a skilled craftsman, right? The wood carver, he's carving, the weaver is weaving, and that they're a skilled craftsperson, and they put their soul into their product. And that capitalism is reducing them from being a skilled craftsman to being merely the appendage of a machine, right? That a factory worker is simply an appendage of a machine, and they don't put their soul into their product. And Marx talks about alienated labor, right? And how there's no human soul, there's no spiritual connection to the product, there's no skilled craftsman, a worker is just on the assembly line. We're now in a new phase where we're entering a time period where capitalism is stripping the machines of their appendages. They don't need workers on the assembly line any longer. They don't need human beings to work in their factories. Never before has capitalism had such a great technological advance as it is having today. This huge leap in technology, eliminating the worker from the assembly line. We're on the verge of having self-driving cars in the United States. People that trade stocks for a living are losing their jobs, right? This is a huge, huge leap in the means of production, in the ability to produce, and it is making this problem that I described here bigger and more intense than ever before. We, the workers, cannot afford to buy back the products that we are producing. We, the workers, cannot afford to buy back the products we are producing. There is a global apparatus of production that has been created. All over the world, workers are coming together. There's this global apparatus of production where, products are made in how many different countries now? Huge, huge leaps are happening. However, we cannot afford to buy back all these products that are being more efficiently created than ever. David Fox is pointing out that they have fully automated mines in Australia now. This is the reality. And this is the basis of the global economic crisis, right? In 2008, the housing bubble burst. Why did the housing bubble burst? Because the American people could not afford to keep buying homes, and the American people's living standards were dropping. So all across the United States, people couldn't afford to keep buying homes. So people were getting what you might call predatory loans. All kinds of loans that had been previously outlawed were legalized, and people were buying homes, and continuing to buy homes, even though they didn't have the financial means to do it. Furthermore, people who already owned homes were taking out mortgages so they could keep spending money because their incomes had gone down. The spending power of the American public has gone down. The good-paying industrial jobs are not there. The younger generation has a much lower wage and living standard than the parents, and we just can't afford to keep buying. And Alan Greenspan and the economists were desperately trying to keep the American public spending money. They needed the American public to keep buying products, at the same rate, even though the US public could not afford to do so. The income of the average American has significantly declined. That white picket fence, that beautiful suburban home that was the staple of the American dream got foreclosed on. Living standards are declining across the United States, and that's bad for working people, but it also has a crisis on Wall Street, because at the same time that our living standards are going down, they're producing goods more efficiently than ever. We can't afford to buy back the products we're making. That essentially is the problem. Capitalism is entering a crisis of overproduction. If you want to read a great book, read Nelson Peary's book, The Future is Up to Us. He's writing in like the late 90s, I believe, and he explains it in great detail, exactly what's happening with automation, with the computer revolution. Read about it. I mean, this is the situation that we are in. This is a classic glut of overproduction. John Maynard Keynes called it underconsumption. But we, Marxists have always called it overproduction. The capitalist is driving to produce products that cannot be sold. This is the inherent built-in problem of capitalism, of production for profit. That is the problem. That's the problem. That is the problem. That is what is driving the global economic crisis. And there's only really one way that it can be resolved, is we need a government of action to fight for working families. And what that ultimately means is we need the state to direct production. Production must be organized by the state to serve public good, not left up to the anarchy of production. The means of production, the major centers of economic power, must be forced by the state to operate in the interests of society overall. We need the state to control the means of production. And that is why China has escaped this cycle. Right? You'll notice that in China, even the private companies do not function according to the market logic. They do what the state tells them to do. Right? When the state controls the means of production, you can eliminate this built-in crisis, right? I use the example of the 2015 drop on the Chinese stock market. 2015, there was this horrendous drop on the Chinese stock market, and nothing happened because less than 6% of the Chinese public is in any way tied in with the stock market. The Chinese economy is centered around the government, not the stock market. The stock market exists to bring in foreign investment. It's kind of a gambling casino for foreign investors, but the state controls the means of production. And within a week, the Chinese stock market had bounced right back up, right? Because the government stepped in. They said anyone caught short selling will be arrested. Am I interested in creating a socialist curriculum through CPI? Of course I am. I'm trying to educate people about socialism. I'm not campaigning for anyone. I'm not an activist, but I give classes about socialism. Good friends of mine also do, and we need to educate people about these topics, about the problems of capitalism, about the history of the socialist movement. I would like to educate people and give them this kind of knowledge. Socialism is becoming more and more popular than ever before. It's wildly popular. Socialism is just wildly, wildly popular. However, the lack of knowledge is massive. People have no idea that there used to be a communist party in this country that was massive, that was key in fighting for civil rights, and people have no idea that the Socialist Party of this country with Eugene Debs was massive and had great things. How do we wrest control from the current system? Well, I'm not a political activist, but ultimately, people need to be brought into the political process. Right? There's a huge effort to drive people out of politics. But we're at the point where people are being brought into the political process. People cannot escape it right now. People's lives are being affected. People would like to just care about the football game and watch pornography at home, but they can't do it, right? Their lives are desperately affected. The rise of Bernie Sanders, the rise of Trump, this is because people are suffering, and they need a leader. They need government forces to intervene to protect them. And we are entering a political crisis, and the answer is people have to become political. They have to take history into their own hands. They have to educate themselves about these topics, and they have to get involved, right? They have to. As long as people remain passive observers, things are only going to get worse. There needs to be involvement. The U.S. public has to take responsibility for its own history and for the future of the country. And there needs to be a mass education of the people as they do that, because there are fights going on among the ruling class. I was listening to Donald Trump today. I was listening to his address to CPAC. And Donald Trump is speaking to a very specific, it's very obvious. He's talking to a very specific faction. When he starts going off about the oil prices and how the USA is energy independent, this is Donald Trump's represents one particular faction. Betsy DeVos, the education secretary who really believes in charter schools, and this is one particular faction of the ruling class, and they basically have one desire. They want deregulation. They want to maximize their own profits. And there's another faction of the ruling class that wants to use the state to try and stabilize things, to prevent some kind of social explosion and stabilize society. They realize that as the country is getting poorer, as people's wages are going down, as the infrastructure is falling apart, people are getting angry, and they're going to rally around people like Trump. They're going to rally around people like Bernie Sanders. There's a section of the ruling class that wants stability. It's probably the richest of the rich. They want stability. They want to stabilize things and gradually reduce the population, basically. That's the richest of the rich. Rockefeller, DuPont, Carnegie, that's what they want, right? They think they want more government regulation, and they want to reduce the population, right? And they want to gradually, they realize they don't need as many workers, so they just want to gradually reduce the population and stabilize society. They don't want a big explosion. Trump represents the opposite faction. The faction that Trump represents, what they want is they want to completely, reduce the role of government in the economy, right? They want to privatize things and allow smaller businesses to do better and compete, right? They want to maximize the profits. Someone's asking me about China being capitalist. There's a whole section in my book talking about this. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. In China, there's a massive rate of state ownership. They have 5-year plans, and even private companies can't do what they just want to do. The state has the power. 90 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a market economy controlled by the state. The state controls the market to make sure that people are not left behind. That's just the reality of how the Chinese economy functions. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. A lot of capitalism, but controlled by the state. The state controls it, and that's ultimately the model that will probably take hold here in the United States, I would say, right? I mean, I think that entrepreneurialism and small business owners and tech firms and all kinds of things will play a big role in American socialism. We are very much an entrepreneurial people, but we can unleash that entrepreneurialism and that American spirit in order to build socialism. I believe we fundamentally can do that. And I hope that answers the question. But yes, I see China as a socialist society. And it's a problem. It's a society with problems. They have corruption there. They have difficulties. And I would never want the Chinese system to come to the United States. I would never want the Russian system to come to the United States. I would never want the Cuban system to come to the United States. The only system that will ever bring socialism and be effective will be a socialism with American characteristics, rooted in our own conditions. So now I'm being asked about the Rockefellers supported Mao. Oh boy. Oh boy. Oh boy. All right. So here's the thing. In the 70s, right, when the Gang of Four was running China, and the Soviet Union and China were not getting along, during that time, we remember Richard Nixon went to China. And, basically, set the stage for eventually China and the United States opening diplomatic relations, which they did under the Carter years. And that, all over the world, we saw Maoist communist parties being used against the Soviet Union. The first example was Angola, where, the MPLA was fighting the UNITA terrorists who were claiming that they were Maoists. And yes, Rockefeller wrote an op-ed in the New York Times basically advocating that the USA have diplomatic relations with China, and he praised Mao for some of his economic accomplishments. How does that prove that Rockefeller supported Mao? It doesn't. It just proves that the Rockefellers, who were backing Henry Kissinger, had a geopolitical strategy of aligning China with the United States against the Soviet Union. And that's why Henry Kissinger advised Nixon to go to China. That's all that proves. It's in a good article, too. The fact that even John D. Rockefeller admits that Mao had huge achievements for the Chinese population. There you go. The other thing that they'll raise is that Mao went to Yale. Well, he didn't go to Yale in Connecticut. Mao went to a university in China that was, tied to Yale University in the United States because he was a college student in the 20s, right? Mao was a college student. He was a university librarian. And Yale gets Rockefeller funding, so therefore it's all a big Illuminati thing up high on the. I mean, give me a break, folks. Give me a break. Give me a break. Come on. The United States did more to crush the Chinese Revolution than anything else. It's just, yeah, in the final years of Mao's life, they aligned with China against the Soviet Union. When China was pushing what it called the theory of three worlds, and during the Second World War, let's not forget that the United States gave weapons to both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao to fight the Japanese. The Japanese were our enemy in the war, and so the United States armed both the Japanese, both factions in China to fight the Japanese invaders, right? And that happened, right? Does that then prove that somehow Mao is, secretly an agent of the Rockefeller? I mean, this is the conspiracy mindset. No one's good in the conspiracy mindset. Everyone is evil. Everyone's, part of the vast conspiracy. There is no hope. Our freedom is being taken away. It's a boot being stomped on the human face. I mean, that's the narrative you get. And that's a really tragic narrative. I feel sorry for people who live in that world, right? Where it's pretty clear that the United States, didn't have any love for Mao. The bookstores are full of books reprinting, all kinds of slanders and allegations against Mao Zedong on a personal level. There's that book, The Private Life of Chairman Mao, written by his doctor, and it says all kinds of really nasty things about Mao on a personal level, and all kinds of people who were Mao's personal friends read that book and said it's not even true. This guy was like Mao's doctor one time. You read that book, you would think that Mao is, pure evil and pure disgusting, and it's, there's every rumor, every nasty rumor about Mao is republished and promoted. They don't have any love for Mao. They really don't, right? However, yes, in the final years of Mao's life, they saw the Soviet Union as an ally or they saw Mao and China as an ally against the Soviet Union. And in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter opened up diplomatic relations with China, and that's when, the free trade zones and Deng Xiaoping, and that was a whole strategy of Henry Kissinger. During the Cold War, Henry Kissinger had the idea of aligning with China against the Soviet Union. In fact, the New York Times in 1950, before Stalin even died, said that the main strategy of the United States was to divide the Soviet Union and China, right? It's actually fascinating. You should read, well, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should just listen to me talk about it. But, read these Cold Warriors. Learn how they viewed things, I've been reading a biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was the Cold War strategist who, basically was the father of color revolutions. He was the guy who was responsible for the U.S. He lured the Soviet Union into Afghanistan, the Afghan trap. You read about Brzezinski. He was a Polish guy who just hated Catholics. He was a Catholic guy who just hated Russians. He was a Polish Catholic, and from the time he was a child, he was raised to just hate Russians. And he ended up, at Harvard, and he was first in Vancouver and then at Harvard, and he became this big Cold War geopolitical strategist. You read about Zbigniew Brzezinski. This is just a hateful man, and he didn't hate communism. He hated Russians. You read it. He hated Russians. And he saw, it fitted into years and years of Poland and Russia, fighting each other and having rivalries and such. And his daughter, right, the daughter of the man who basically, is more responsible than anyone else for the creation of Al-Qaeda, right? Well, she's on Morning Joe, right? Morning Joe, Mika Brzezinski, that's her father, Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? The Cold War strategist. The man who bragged about, bringing Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. You read about these people. It's fascinating. These people, I might add, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Ben Rhodes, Samantha Power. These people are more important than our political leaders, I would say. Our political leaders are actors, right? They come out there, they smile for the cameras, they give their speeches, but the people in the back room, the smart guys, or smart women too, right? Samantha Power, right? It's smart men, smart women. The people who went to Harvard and Yale, those kind of people who sit behind the leaders and come up with their strategies they're the ones that's important to understand. They are very, very important to understand. What motivates them? Where did they come from? What is their background? Why are they the way they are? Those people are very, very important. We don't see them very much. And there's probably a lot of them we don't even know about. The ones we know about are the ones that are a little more prominent. They try not to hide as much. But, Ben Rhodes, right? Ben Rhodes, that writer who worked with, Obama or whatever. That guy is very important. That guy was negotiating with members of the Castro family in Canadian hotels. Read about Ben Rhodes, right? Read about Samantha Power. Read about Zbigniew Brzezinski. Read about Henry Kissinger. These people are far, far more important. These are the people that tell the presidents and all of them. Jimmy Carter said he was a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? And that these folks have more influence than you would think, and the way they see the world is often far more vulgar and disgusting, than the way these other people see it. Leo Strauss, right, was the mentor to so many of the people that were in Republican and Democratic administrations, right? The father of neoconservatism, Leo Strauss, the other father of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol. Read about these people. Find out who they are and their motivations. My new book that will be coming out soon, it's in the works, long way off. It's going to have a lot about that. I've done a lot of research. One thing that fascinates me, folks, is you can look at certain personalities, right? The ruling class of the United States, when they are picking out people to be leaders, they look for certain personality types. It's very fascinating. Very fascinating. There is a psychology to what makes an effective political leader. They talk about how we've had a lot of presidents in recent years who have no fathers, right? And there's a lot written about that, right? Barack Obama, dreams from my father, right? Fascinating, right? We talk about Bill Clinton, right? I mean, and again, that there's something about the personality of a man who grew up without a father in his household that makes something that the ruling class likes in a political leader, right? Fascinating, I think, right? I have been particularly interested in a certain profile. First of all, the U.S. criminal justice system. Let's talk about this, right? The U.S. criminal justice system. Stop watching police shows. That's fiction. That is just pure fiction. Stop watching police shows, right? Like 90% of cases, 99% of cases do not go to trial in the United States. Almost every case, every criminal case, almost every single criminal case in the United States doesn't go to trial, right? It's plea bargained. So if somebody goes to trial in the United States, they're probably innocent. Why would you risk what they call the trial penalty, right? Google the phrase trial penalty. If you go to trial in the United States, the judge is angry that you made him work, that you cost the taxpayers so much money. And they call it the trial penalty, right? And that your sentence will be far greater if you actually go to trial. So the chances that someone would risk the trial penalty and not make a plea bargain, like almost every criminal case in the United States, is very, 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 very rare, right? When a case goes to trial in the United States, something's off. Now, in some states, they have like a 3-strike law. So if it's your third strike, your third felony, you automatically get 25 years. Yeah, they'll go to trial whether they're innocent or guilty. So there are some exceptions. But if a trial takes place in the United States, if a trial happens in the USA, if someone's actually going to have a jury trial and going to risk the trial penalty, if someone is going to put themselves through that's years of your life. Years of your life. You're not knowing if you're going to prison, the amount of money that you'll spend. If someone is going to risk going through the horrendous nightmare of having a jury trial, right, of spending all their money and all their relatives' money on attorneys, of spending a year of their life waiting to go to trial, weeks in the trial. I mean, if someone is going to put themselves through that, they're probably innocent. I mean, there's other cases, right? Really wealthy people, do you think Harvey Weinstein cares? He's wealthy enough. It's not a big deal. He'd rather go to trial than not, but for the most part, if an average American goes to trial, they are probably innocent. You would never see that on American TV, right? On American TV, the cop shows, oh, no. The courts are so easy on the criminals. The criminals always get off on technicalities, blah, blah. It's malarkey. That's not the case. So first of all, if someone goes to trial, the chances are they're innocent, right? Now, there are exceptions. Harvey Weinstein, they're wealthy enough, or it's their third strike in Florida or California, and, that's a big issue. But if someone's going to trial in the United States, if they are risking having a jury trial, which is very expensive, which is very scary, which takes years of their life, all of their money, if someone is risking having a jury trial in the United States, there's a very, very good chance that they are innocent. However, the conviction rate in American courts is ridiculously high. People are almost always found guilty, right? In New York City, the borough of the Bronx has a 67% conviction rate at trial, right? That's not 2/3, right? That's slightly more than 2/3. And it is one of the lowest in the country. 67%, Most parts of this country, conviction rates are 80%, 90%. If you go to trial, the chances of you being acquitted are slim to none. Why? Because prosecutors are the government, and they have the money. They have the money, they have the evidence, they have the apparatus. Furthermore, police lie on the stand all the time. Don't take my word for it. Read what Alan Dershowitz has written. Everyone knows this. Police get up, and it's like your obligation when you're a police officer to lie on the stand. And they never get prosecuted. Why? Because the people who decide who to prosecute for perjury are the prosecutors. So police get up and lie on the stand, and all these Americans have watched police cop shows, so they believe police officers, and police just make up stuff on the stand all the time. You read about police perjury, it's a whole thing. People have documented this. Police officers lie on the stand all the time. Prosecutors have way more money and resources at their hands. Plus, Americans have been brainwashed by cop shows on TV, and they're convinced that criminals get off too easy, and they have this false view of the police system. So the criminal justice system in the United States is a joke, right? It is just like any other country, really. I mean, it looks better, but in essence, it's the same thing. When the government wants to go after somebody, they go after them. And maybe if the person's rich enough and well-connected enough and has the time and the optics, and they can get off. But for the most part, they don't. Right? That's basically the U.S. legal system. And that's how it is in most countries in the world. And in most countries, it's a little more honest than that. In most countries, it's, if the state comes after you, you better be well-connected enough and rich enough to get yourself off, or you're screwed. That's how it is in the United States, basically. If they decide to start prosecuting you and come after you, they come after you. And if you're well-connected enough, and sometimes you can get justice, but for the most part, you're screwed. That's basically the U.S. criminal justice system. And it's a joke. And it is designed to look like it's not. And the cop shows and Law and Order and all of that is a lot of propaganda. And it's propaganda that's key in making it happen, mind you, right? If it weren't for that propaganda, jurors might know what I'm saying. Most jurors most Americans have no clue. Most Americans believe that every criminal goes to trial because they don't want to go to jail. Most Americans have no idea what I'm saying because they've been watching Law and Order their whole life. But the reality is that if somebody goes to trial, they're probably innocent. Yet 90% of people, in most cases, in the Bronx, it's only 67%. So only 2/3 of people are convicted at trial. I mean, it's really, really ridiculous, right? That said, criminal prosecutors in the United States are a special brand of person, right? Because these are people who really, really take pleasure in harming people who are probably innocent. Let's be real, right? If they're going to go to trial, if you're a courtroom prosecutor, right? You're a courtroom prosecutor. The chances are something's wrong with you, right? If you know anything about how the U.S. criminal justice system works, something's wrong with you, right? I mean, I've talked to former prosecutors, and they will tell you straight up how rigged it is against the defense. They don't care. They have a sadism about them. They have a desire to punish, to harm, to injure. And a lot of what they train these prosecutors to do is to help cover that up and help try to conceal that desire on their part, because if people see it, jurors might acquit because they can tell how much they want to harm people. But, Amy Klobuchar, right, who's running for president right now. Now, one thing that she would do in order to convince jurors to, imprison African Americans who are on trial is she would bring in a gang expert. And this gang expert would get up and tell horror stories about gangs, scare the crap out of the jurors, and convict. And again, where she was, why would any person go to trial unless there's something wrong if they're going on trial? You know what I'm saying? She would bring in a gang expert to scare jurors, make them terrified of African Americans and gangs and whatever, and vote to convict. And she doesn't know who the president of Mexico is, right? Amy Klobuchar. Kamala Harris, right? She was a prosecutor in California. Her whole life, she's been a prosecutor. She concealed evidence to keep people on death row. She locked people up for smoking weed and then joked about the fact that she smoked weed all through college, right? What's going on here? It takes a certain type of personality to be a prosecutor in the United States, right? And they do their jobs fanatically, right? It's all about stats. They want those stats. If anyone's acquitted, they've failed, right? If somebody's life isn't destroyed by their work, they have failed. They want stats, and they want to harm people. Why do they want? What's going on here, right? What's the issue here, right? And there's a lot about this, you know what I mean? But in a legal system where people only go to trial if they're probably innocent, but yet you have, massively high conviction rates. What is going on here? Now, what I think is fascinating. So Kamala Harris, her father was a communist. Is a communist, right? He's a Marxist economist. She hates her father. Right? Her parents divorced when she was 7 years old. Her father has denounced her politically and said she's beholden to her donors. She talks about her mother a lot. She does not speak about her father, right? Interesting, right? Kamala Harris, who she just absolutely, she really, she's a prosecutor and she tries to keep innocent people on death row. She started locking up the parents. I don't know if people saw the clip of her locking up the parents of truant school children. And she laughs about it uncomfortably. She says, we had this policy of locking up parents for truancy, and she giggles about it. Her audience doesn't giggle with her. There's nothing funny about that, right? Sure, kids should be in school, but when low-income children are not in school, how does putting their parents in jail help the situation? It doesn't, right? It's demented. But before she starts that, she says, I wouldn't be anywhere if it weren't for my education. What does this have to do with you, Kamala? This isn't about you. But you're making decisions about who should go to jail because you wouldn't be anywhere without your education. Something's not right here. Something's not right. Kamala Harris, you watch her mocking protesters. But, you got to think about that moment during the debate. All right, that moment during the debate where she yells at Joe Biden, "That little girl was me." Very interesting. Kamala Harris, there's something psychological here. Kamala Harris doesn't really care about those kids who are truant from school. She's angry at their parents for not being good parents, right? She's angry at their parents for not being good parents. So she wants to punish those parents for not sending their kids to school because she wouldn't be there because that little girl was me. And she's got this pent up anger. Right? Think about it. Right? There's something going on there. She's angry with her own parents, most likely with her own father. And that rage, that desire to punish and destroy seems to have motivated Kamala's entire life existence, right? And she's up there and she's thinking about herself. That little girl was me. She has a t-shirt with a picture of her as an elementary school child. There's some childhood trauma there. There's some rage at her father, rage at her own parents, and she has spent her entire life trying to get revenge for it in this demented way, by putting all kinds of people in jail, by trying to keep innocent men on death row. That's Kamala Harris. But fascinatingly, Amy Klobuchar, same story. I mean, she's from a different ethnic background. She's not half Jamaican and half Indian. She's actually Eastern European, Minnesota, criminal prosecutor for years, right? Domestic violence. Parents divorced, her father was an alcoholic, beat her mother. She didn't speak to her father for a decade until he got sober. And what did she do? She spent her career desperately trying to punish other people, put them in jail, trying to destroy other people's lives. Desperately trying to do it, right? desperately trying to do it. She had that gang expert who would get up and scare jurors about, gangs and appeal to their internal racial fear of African Americans. Oh my God, get these jurors who don't understand that if someone's going to trial, the chances are they're probably innocent. Get those jurors on there and get a gang expert to just scare the crap out of them. Somebody who doesn't even know anything about the case and just gets up there and scares them all about gangs are going to kill them and rap music and appeals to their inner fears, puts them in jail. Right? Why does she do that? Well, I have a feeling that if you were to get to know Amy Klobuchar, which I don't, I'm just speculating, it's a lot like Kamala Harris. That little girl was me. There's this internal rage, right? Just like Kamala is clearly very angry at her own parents, especially at her own father. Amy Klobuchar is very angry at her father. The pent-up rage. She wants to destroy. She wants to tear people down. Same thing. Samantha Power. Now, Samantha Power was never a prosecutor. Samantha Power, though, right, born in Ireland, right, displays signs of narcissism from the time she's a child, is looking in the mirror and trying desperately to have an American accent and lose her Irish accent, wants to move to the United States because she thinks it's the land of freedom, does move to the United States. Her father does not come with her. Her father is an alcoholic and eventually dies of an alcoholic, basically drinks himself to death in Ireland. What does she do? She grows up to be an international prosecutor. Her entire life revolves around, demonizing Serbia, building the case for war. She's a warmonger, right? And she goes around and she tries her hardest to build a case for war against Yugoslavia. She's responsible for invading Libya. She lobbies within the White House for invading Libya. It's always strong male leaders that she's angry with. Gaddafi, right? Milosevic, right? Assad. It's always these strong male leaders. She just wants to punish them. And just like Kamala Harris doesn't care about those school kids who are truant. It's not about helping those kids. It's about making those parents pay, right? Samantha Power doesn't care about the Libyans. They're far worse off. They're dying, but it doesn't care. It's about making Gaddafi pay, right? She doesn't care about the Serbians or the people of Serbia. No, it's about making Milosevic pay, right? And again, I have a feeling that if you get to know Samantha Power, you get to know Amy Klobuchar, get to know Kamala, it's about that little girl was me. There's this pent-up rage at a father figure, right? There's an abusive father figure, perhaps. I don't know what went on, but there's rage at a father figure. There's a broken home and a broken marriage. There's being raised by a mother who has resentment against the father. There's baggage, and there's this desire to punish. There's this built-in desire to create chaos and punish, right? They don't care. Kamala didn't care about those kids, Samantha Power doesn't care about Libyans, right? She bombed and destroyed their country. They had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. She doesn't care. She's mad at Gaddafi. Right? She doesn't care about the people in former Yugoslavia. She's mad at Milosevic. She sees these powerful male leaders, these populists, these anti-imperialists, and she sees them like that father that she had who, drank himself to death and abandoned her and her mother and when they went to the United States, right? Same with Amy Klobuchar, right? Same with Kamala, right? They want to destroy. They want to hurt people. They want revenge, right? And they want to destroy other people's lives, and it's rooted in some kind of weird childhood trauma where they're sitting there. And I swear, when Kamala gets up there and says, I wouldn't have been anywhere if it weren't for my education, that little girl was me, Joe Biden. That's what it's about. There's some daddy issues going on here. This is an interesting psychological profile of a narcissistic woman, which Kamala and Amy and Samantha Power totally are. When Samantha Power, talks about looking in the mirror, and working hard to lose her American accent. Oh, she's narcissistic women with father issues who have a desire to create chaos and punish. That is the profile. That is the profile of a female politician, right? This is people working out their wounds. Just like on some level, Obama is probably trying to work out, he writes a whole book basically admitting that he's motivated, the dreams from my father, black identity, all these political leaders. This isn't just about women. It's about men also. But they all have some, these are people that are damaged. These are people that have suffered, right? And they're damaged. They're not doing well. They've suffered. They're in pain. They're in deep emotional pain. And it seems like that's the profile of who you want when you want war. I mean, it's fascinating, right? That when you see Hillary Clinton there, he came, he saw, he died. She's so excited about killing Gaddafi. What's that about? What's that about? Think about it, right? This is a way to manipulate people psychologically. The CIA, all of them. You read about the psychological studies that they've done. Read about how they've worked on how to manipulate leaders, how to manipulate them. They talk about Ronald Reagan wouldn't read anything, so they would give Ronald Reagan videotapes and show him like VHS tapes of world events to like manipulate him to do what he wants to do. The people who really have the power in the government, people who really have the power in the government aren't the politicians. The politicians are the actors. They're the front man. It's those smart guys in the back room. It's Ben Rhodes. It's Zbigniew Brzezinski. It's Henry Kissinger. It's Samantha Power. It's Anne Marie Slaughter. Those are the people that really have the power. Those are the people who really have the power. The ones who never get elected. The ones who go up through Harvard and get their degree, you know what I mean? And they go to Harvard and Yale and they write papers that put forward positions. They get them all kinds of grant money and foundation. And pretty soon they're sitting in the back room with Obama, or sitting in the back room with Trump, or sitting in the back room with Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter, writing out foreign policy. Those are the people who really have the power. And if you can understand psychologically what motivates them, if you can understand why these people do what they do, you can understand how the world works, right? I mean, this profile of a female prosecutor politician, right? And their love for war, and their obsession with punishing men, right? Think about the man, the innocent man that Kamala Harris worked so hard to keep on death row. Why was she so determined to see this innocent man die? Why? What drives that kind of pathological behavior? What drives it, right? What's the same thing that probably, was very useful to empire and imperialism in driving Samantha Power into the fanatical desire to see Libya bombed and destroyed? Maybe the same with Hillary Clinton, right? We don't know. But they are masters of manipulation. They've studied, they have psychological profiles. And people, when someone runs for president, their whole life story comes out there. We learn everything there is to know about them. And you can bet that they know way more than we do. They know way, way more than we do. Fascinating to think about. Psychology, right? That's the thing. People want to dismiss psychology. People want to see psychology in individual ways. But psychology is very important, right? What motivates world leaders to do what they do? What motivated Roosevelt to do what he did, right? I mean, Roosevelt, my goodness, right? Somebody from one of the richest families in the world. Somebody, what in the world motivated Roosevelt to do such good things, right? What motivated him? Well, a lot of people trace it back to his teacher, Endicott Peabody, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He went to a boarding school, and it was a very liberal boarding school, very progressive. They very much allowed the kids to learn on their own. They gave the kids lots of affection, and the principal of the boarding school that Franklin Delano Roosevelt went to was a socialist, a member of the Socialist Party of the United States, Endicott Peabody, right? And at the time in the United States, our education system was even more authoritarian and militarized than it is now, and, corporal punishment and all that. But the fact that Roosevelt went to a very, very liberal, progressive elementary school taught by a socialist, where kids were treated with so much kindness and dignity, I think that, more than anything, had a long-term effect on Franklin Roosevelt, right? Who's to say what Roosevelt would have done if he had grown up in a different atmosphere? But think about the impact that Endicott Peabody, the socialist Christian minister, had on the young Franklin Roosevelt. Think about it, right? I mean, Roosevelt's personality was imprinted by the fact that he went to an elementary school where children were treated in a very, very progressive and loving and kind way, and basically taught to have socialistic and communal values. Right? Fascinating to think about. Think about it. I mean, think about it. Think about how much this socialist school principal probably impacted human history. The fact that somebody would eventually be the president of the United States went to an elementary school taught by a very progressive, kind, loving, socialist Christian man named Endicott Peabody. It's fascinating to think about. The psychology of world leaders, understanding what motivates them to do what they do, is very, very, very important. It's very, very important. You can't underestimate all of this, right? If you read about psychological programming, you read about propaganda, you read about mass manipulation. All of this is very, very important to understand. The world is, there are many factors. You got to understand economics. I believe economics is the base of it all as a materialist. But I think psychology is important. I think history is very important. I think spiritual matters are very important. It's all very, very fascinating. So I hope this has been of interest to everyone. I appreciate you all being here. It's a lovely, lovely night. I have to be on my way. But I wish you all the best. I really do. I wish you all the best, right? Folks, we need a government of action that will fight for working families. And if you want to get involved in a project to spread socialist education throughout this country and educate people about socialism, sign up below to attend the CPI conference. Please sign up below. Register. We need you at the CPI conference. It's going to be very, very important because the stakes are getting higher. The stakes are getting higher. The world is changing. World events are moving very, very rapidly. Folks, a new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Thank you very much.